Good morning, Dean. Slipped in during prayer time. Okay, so brief introduction. I said this last week. I'll say it briefly and quickly. The book of Genesis is one of the most important books in the Bible. Obviously, it serves as the introduction for the Old Testament, of course, but it's more than that. It serves as the bedrock for the entire Bible. There are many things that would not make much sense to us were they not explained and fathomed and sort of threaded out in Genesis. We would get to Exodus and wonder, why does God have such an interest in these Hebrew slaves that he's willing to move heaven and earth to get them out of Egypt? Well, we would miss the whole Abrahamic covenant and everything that Genesis told us there. Good morning, Kitty. And so I would argue it is one of the most important books in the Bible. The title Genesis comes from the Pentateuch, which means 5 books, and it literally just means the origin, the beginnings. And we talked about that. There are a number of beginnings in Genesis. We have the beginning of life. We have the beginning of man. We have the beginning of sin. We have the beginning of death. We have the Genesis, the origins of a lot of different things when you begin to look at Genesis like that. The author. It's widely accepted, and up until recently, that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. He wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, as you look at it that way, 104 times in the Pentateuch, it says the Lord spoke to Moses. Now, as you think about that, here's the idea you should have. The Lord spoke to Moses. The Lord spoke 104 times. So as you think about where did Moses get the material, well, some of it was divine revelation. Some of it was God supernaturally speaking to Moses. Some of it, like the 10 Commandments, was God supernaturally writing with his finger on stone. Some of it was supernatural, just like that. 4 times we read Moses wrote. Again, so as you think about the Pentateuch, and Jesus would agree with us that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, and I gave you those verses out of Matthew last week. Where did the information come from? We'll briefly run through this. Moses received it through direct revelation. That's for sure. Some of it came that way. No doubt about it. The 10 Commandments are direct revelation. He received it passed down from generation to generation through oral tradition. Now, I don't believe all of it is, because we clearly know some of it is supernaturally revealed, but some of it could have been passed down through oral tradition. Now, as you think about the time frame in Genesis, roughly 2,400 years, if you're thinking just block time, Dean, you might be thinking, there's just no way you can keep the oral tradition going for 2,400 years. It'll get all twisted up and messed up. You know how humans are. They'll mess this thing up. Well, just keep in mind, prior to the flood and even after the flood, men lived a very, 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 very long time. And so as you think about the genealogies, just look at Adam. So Adam was alive when his son, grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, great-great-grandson, you can see this. So he would have been there to check these stories as they said, yeah, let me tell you what happened in the garden. And I'm going to say, no, that's not what happened. Let me tell you what happened. So I don't have a problem that some of this was oral tradition. Now, was it necessarily so? I don't know, but I don't have a problem that some of it was. But there's something else here. I believe also, at least a third vein of where we get Genesis, is that there were written records being passed down from generation to generation. I showed you this last week in the Hebrew word toledoth. This is the history of. This is the record of. That phrase is used a total of 13 times and creates 9 divisions in Genesis that identify the time frame being written about and the person who wrote it, the Toledoth. And so I believe as we look at Genesis, what we see is, number one, a book that is divine revelation, a book that probably contains some oral tradition, especially the bigger, more significant things they would have been handing down traditionally. And then equally, it covers things that they were keeping in writing. I believe the book of Genesis likely is all 3 of those things. Now, does it have to be all 3? No. It's definitely some of it's divine revelation. No doubt about that one. What you do with the next 2 doesn't really matter. I just wanted to answer the question. Also on our SharePoint site, or our website, I put up the genealogies document, all of the genealogies in Genesis, who the father was, who the son was, the father's age when the son was born. Is there evidence this is a direct descendant? The year since creation when the son was born, the father's age when he died, the year since creation when the father died. In other words, I'm trying to present you an easy map to navigate Genesis and the history of Genesis as you look at all these people and their lives. But again, that does a beautiful job of doing it as well. Now, to preload you with one piece of information, the year of the flood, 1,656 years after creation, if indeed all of the histories in Genesis are true, which I would argue they are, and you can see what happens to man's life span following the flood. Only guy to live those 900 and whatever years was indeed Noah. Everyone after him started living less time, down to what we see today, 100 and something years. So Moses came in right over here. So Moses is about 2,400 years. Great question. Thank you for that, George. So we'll put Moses right there. Again, he comes out of a different line. That's why he's not here. Great question. So again, lifespans started to shrink. We'll need to think about that when we get to the flood. Whatever happened impacted man immediately, and that impact continued to where we have the lifespans we see today. But again, this is also up on our website if you like that. So we talked about the main theories. Let me make sure. I think that's everything. One more thing I want to say before we pause and we get to our verses. So Genesis is not only human history. It indeed is that. It's going from Adam all the way to Joseph. It's walking us through, and it's clear this is one of the children of the Father. This is one of the children of the Father. But I would say this. The Bible is not a history book, but where it speaks about history, it speaks with absolute authority. The Bible is not a science book. That's not its purpose. But where it speaks about science, I would argue we need to take God seriously and consider what it says. I would argue that God probably knows more about the formation of space and time than anyone on this planet. God probably knows more about the genesis of man than anyone on this planet. God knows more about the origin of the species than anyone on this planet. So I would argue when he talks about it, we should take it serious. And so that brings us now, that was all by introduction, that brings us to our lesson, back to Genesis 1, verse 1. Now as we go in, I do want to highlight something so that you see it. Now last week I told you the word for God used in Genesis 1:1 is Elohim. We'll talk more about that in just a second. It's used 35 times. If you read Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, it gets extremely repetitive. God, 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 God. It's just over and over again. But there's other repetition I want you to see. The first one is the phrase, God said. It occurs 10 times throughout 1:1 through 2:3. This idea, God said, and bang, it happens. And you'll see that repetition as we work through the verses. There's another one that I want you to see, and that's the phrase, according to their kind. Starting with the plants, God keeps saying that each kind of thing recreates itself. Its seed is within itself. The DNA to produce again is always after its own kind. Now, what that means is we probably should not expect to see one kind transition into another kind. And indeed, I would argue the rock layers don't show us that, where if it was happening, there would be a lot of examples. Equally, we should expect that one kind cannot mate with another kind. So a dog cannot mate with a cat to create a dat, let's say. I'm just saying. So there are examples of things we should not expect to see. So this is an example of something we should not expect to see. Okay? And I'm serious. Another example of something we should not expect to see. Again, I'm having a little fun, but I think you understand my point. One final example of something we should not expect to see. We should not expect to see two different kinds of animals mating and creating a new kind. Now, should we expect that those of the canine kind can produce across kinds possibly? Yes. Should we not be surprised that in some cases they'll lose that ability because the DNA separation will get so extreme that even it can't happen there? Absolutely. But we should, again, based on Genesis, we should never expect anything like that. Now, this is the tree of life. You can get this out of any science book. Now, this is real nice. It's a beautiful little diagram that explains how everything started as a single-cell organism here. By the way, we don't know where that single-cell organism came from or how it came to be. We have no explanation of how non-living chemicals, non-living materials formed a cell, a replicating cell, life. Life is the thing we cannot reproduce. We can take a cell and puncture the membrane and let all the mechanical machines out of it, but we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. We can't make one single cell, much less this. What's interesting, if you just take this in, if you're sitting in a science class and go, wow, that answers the question. Okay, well, show me the transitional form that created the wolf, the horse, the lion, the bear, and the walrus. Show me that in the rock record. Show me anything remotely that would even give you the idea of that. It doesn't exist. How about this one? Show me the form that was the camel, the one form of a deer, and the hippopotamus. This is not science. This is religion. This is faith. This is a belief. This is not founded, I would argue, in science. Now, this is founded in science. We're fairly certain that all the dogs can be traced to the wolf. That is science. That's the canine kind, I would argue. And over time, through genetic separation, and we keep taking one that has this trait and mating him with one who has that same trait, and all of a sudden we're able to produce that trait. But that's just diversity in the DNA. This is science. This is replicatable and provable. So according to their kind, thirdly, 6 times, and then it culminates at the end of creation in the 7th time, God said it was good. And then when it was all done, he said it was very good. As we look at the creation prior to the fall, we should see a God who made a creation that was very good. It was the perfect home for man. It was the perfect paradise for man. It was indeed 7 times, if we take the last one, very good. 6 times, the phrase evening and morning were the X day is used. And it culminates in the rest that occurs on the 7th day. We'll talk more about that one, so I won't say anything else about it. Number 5. In the first 3 verses of chapter 2, 5 times it emphasizes that God finished or God was done with the work that he had to do. Creation was a work that, as we will see, the Lord Jesus Christ did, and he did it in 6 days, and he was finished. He was done with the work. He completed the work. Now, if you're thinking, because I read an article that said, well, the day is ongoing, sort of the implication is that the work is ever ongoing. No. Jesus Christ created, and he was done. Let me give you another work of Jesus Christ. He came to redeem, he worked, and after 33 and a half years, or if you prefer 3.5 years of his ministry, he was done. It is finished. Here's how Jesus said it. My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish, accomplish, complete his work. And I would argue that the same was true in creation. He came doing the will of the Father. We'll see this. He created and he was finished. And now redemption comes. He comes to redeem and he finishes. He's the finisher, we might say. And then lastly, 3 times is emphasized, this included all of his work of creation. So creation is not ongoing. He is done. He is created, and we live in that marvelous creation. We'll talk about the heavens being stretched out. So those are the 6 things I wanted you to see by way of repetition, not to be confused with Elohim being mentioned 35 times in 1:1 through 2:3. So with all that, we finally get to 1 verse 1, back where we started in the beginning. I'm taking my watch off now, so time doesn't matter at this point forward. Time no longer matters. We've got all day. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, some people see that, as you might imagine, and probably the way you see it, is the grand declaration of scriptures. This is like the granddaddy of all declarations, Mike. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But there's other people who also see this as the start of the declaration of what God was doing on day 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Now, as you hear that, you should be thinking, well, wait a minute now, Rich. In one case, it was plural heavens. In the other case, it was singular heaven. I'm not looking at anything. Rich took us off the verse. I'm looking up there, and the ESV says heavens plural. I would argue the King James says heaven singular.
Plural is King James.
New King James. New King James is plural. King James is singular. So what's up here? What's wrong? So the Hebrew word in play is Shemayim. Doesn't matter. When you see Hebrew words with the M ending, I-M, like Elohim and Shemayim, that's a plural ending. Well, the question is, how do they know when to make it plural and when to make it singular, or is it always plural? Well, the word is used 450 times in the Hebrew Bible. Most of the time is translated singular. Shemayim, the heavens, the heaven. So the question was Elohim or Shemayim? Shemayim. 450 times, the great majority singular. So now you should be thinking, well, wait a minute, Rich, that makes no sense. It's a plural word, and they're translating it singular most of the time. I was with Lance yesterday, and this kind of briefly came up, and I said, if I showed you the word deer, like the animal, D-E-E-R, and I said, how many deer are we talking about? What would you say? I just showed you the word. You would say, I need context, right? The deer ran across the road. A dozen of deer ran across the road. Okay, I understand. That's how this word is. It's all based on context. And so the translators look at the context to understand whether they're going to make it singular or plural. If the translator saw the context as the grand declaration, Robert, they translated it plural. If the translating team saw it as, no, this is the start of what God's doing on day one. In the beginning, he created the eretz, the heaven and the earth, eretz, then it's singular because they're seeing day one being explained. So understand those are two positions. I would hold to the latter, but it doesn't really matter. I just want you to see it. This came up with Kristen as we talked about heavens, and I wanted her to hear it. I believe it should be heaven, and you'll see why. So tuck that away. And by the way, we're not going to create the heavens or the heaven church. We're not going to create... No, I belong to the heavens church. I'm sorry, I can't fellowship with you. Again, just understand there are two positions. Understand why. Understand the Hebrew word itself is not going to answer the question for us. We've got to look at context. Understand the context, and I'll let you decide for yourself. Yes, Lyndon, the microphone's coming.
How many heavens are there?
Great. So, okay. I didn't talk about that now, but let's talk about it. So the Bible outlines three heavens. Okay, there's the heaven where our atmosphere, and by the way, you have this in your notes, and I have references for all three of these heavens in case you're just wondering, you want me to prove it. Your references are there. I'm not going to review them with you. You have them. So where the birds fly, where the airplanes fly, where the balloons go, that's our heaven. The Bible indicates another heaven, and that's where the stars are. That's another heaven, plenty of references. Obviously, that's beyond our atmosphere. That's outer space. And then the Bible provides a third heaven where Paul was caught up to the third heaven and he saw things that he couldn't even talk about. That is God's throne. That is likely not another place, but another dimension, but we don't know for sure. We do know it is a real place, and we do know that God really exists there. And those are the three heavens, plural, that we find in the Bible. And thank you for that question, Linda. Very good. So in the beginning, God created the heavens, we'll go with that for the moment because the ESV did, and the earth. Now, this is our beginning. This is man's beginning. This is the beginning of time. This is not God's beginning. God doesn't have a beginning. In fact, that's often the stumper question. Yeah, but where did God come from? God didn't come from anywhere. He's always existed. That's what the Bible declares about our God. Our God doesn't have a beginning. He has always existed. So this is the beginning of time for man. This is the beginning of man's history. In the beginning, God. We talked about it briefly. We'll say it again. Hebrew word Elohim, plural, yet is translated every time singular. Well, in this case, it's always the subject, God did this, and so they look at the verb in Hebrew to match the subject, and the verb is always singular. God created, singular verb. So they translate all of these singular. But what we have, I think, here is even in the first opening verse of Genesis, the mystery of the one God who has a uniplurality. We know it is the triune God in the New Testament. They would not have seen that. They would have seen the majesty of God, the amazement of God. He's one God, yet his name is a plural name. It's Elohim. So they would have just stood at the mystery and the majesty of the one God who, as Henry Moore said, has a uniplurality. And that will not get explained until the New Testament, y'all. There will be hints of that throughout the Old Testament. They will never, ever get the full on face view of it until we get to the New Testament. But they would have seen the majesty of God. And again, that's being repeated 35 times. Now, a little aside, who wrote most of the Psalms, do you think? David, by far, right? 75 named to him, 2 that are credited to him in the New Testament that did not have a name. So he wrote at least 77 of the 150 Psalms. So he wins automatically. Did you know that Moses wrote a psalm? Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. It's Psalm 90. Let's look at the first couple of verses. You'll love this. Lord. By the way, the Hebrew word is Adonai. Lord. You have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You see Moses' theology? Before the earth had been formed, before the mountains had been brought forth, before man ever sucked oxygen into his lungs, there was God who is from everlasting to everlasting. Now, is that a mind bend? Let's be honest. Yes, but you have to believe in something that's everlasting. You have 3 options here. I'll give them to you. You can decide which one you want to go with. Number 1, matter's everlasting. It's always been here. The universe has always been here. Every star you ever see has always been here. It's eternal. All these planets, all of this energy, all of these stars, they have just simply always been here. They are eternal. That's option 1. Option 2, there was a time when there was absolutely nothing. Then the creation, in some kind of majestic, amazing way, created itself out of nothing. So all of the stars and all of the planets and everything we see, it was one day not here, then in some type of amazement freak of science, it created itself out of nothing. Or there's a God who's always existed, who's eternal, and he stepped in, creating time for us because he lives outside of time, and he created everything we see and understand. Those are the only 3 positions there are. You got to grab hold of one of those. Is it amazing that God is eternal? Is it a mind bend? Yeah, absolutely. A couple things I want to show you before we talk more about the eternality of God, because I'm hearing this, looking at these words. If you were a Jew, how would you have handled this? I'm going to read it to you. Lord, you've been, or let's put in the word, Adonai. You have been our dwelling place in all generations. The sovereign one. Adonai, you have been our dwelling place. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed, that's Adonai, we're taking the antecedent pronoun back to the noun, ever you had formed the earth and the world, and from everlasting to everlasting, you are El, you are God. The psalmist, Moses, just referred to Adonai as God. Okay, no problem. No, it's a huge problem. It's a big problem. Jesus used it on the scribes and Pharisees a couple of times to highlight their lack of understanding. A Psalm of David, Psalm 110. The Lord, that's Yahweh. Yahweh said to my Lord, to Adonai, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. When we see Adonai many times in the Old Testament, we're getting a pre-incarnate snapshot picture of Jesus Christ, tucked away in the Old Testament. They wouldn't have seen it, and to be honest, we wouldn't have either at the time. But now on this side of the cross, we see Jesus Christ tucked away throughout the Old Testament on open display once you get it. They wouldn't have got it, we wouldn't have either. On the New Testament side, we see it clearly. Did that answer your question, Sam? Okay. So the eternality of God, just to give you a few verses, because I realize this is a mind bend. So I want to give you just a couple. I don't know how the Jews would have handled Adonai, by the way. I know they missed it. Before the mountains were brought forth, we're going back to Moses, because I want you to read the rest of it, or some more of it. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth of the world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. You return man to the dust and say, return, O child of man, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday. He's outside time. Time is meaningless to him. Time is for us. We live in time meaningless to him. 1,000 years with God is like, where'd I put my keys? I mean, it's nothing. It's nothing to him. This is John 17. You'll be familiar with it. I glorified you on earth, Jesus says, having accomplished the work, there it is again, that you gave me to do. And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before we ever created a thing. That's the triune God on display. Continuing on, Psalm 102. My days are like an evening shadow. I wither away like grass. That is true for every one of us. But you, Yahweh, are enthroned forever. You are remembered throughout all generations. We live and die, generation, and then there's God living on eternally. And there's others. You have them in your notes. I won't take time with them. But again, it is a mind bend, but God is eternal. Back to verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Hebrew word there for created is bara. It means to create. It can highlight creating, like I said in the Latin, ex nihilo, out of nothing, from nothing, no raw materials. When we make things, we go to Home Depot and buy some wood and buy some nails and buy some stuff and we construct something. When God constructs, at least on creation, He simply thinks it into existence. He says it into existence, and out of nothing comes stuff, complex stuff, amazing stuff. Can you imagine? And we can't. If you would have been there on God's shoulder, and I realize God doesn't have a shoulder, right? I get it. If you could have been there on God's shoulder when He created the earth, what did it look like? Did it just poof into existence? Or was it this swirl of elements? Was it this swirl of creative activity? I don't know. But understand, a sovereign God is creating all of these things out of absolutely nothing. Now, as we think about this, because I can't let this go, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The Jews didn't know this. You and I know this. It wasn't God the Father who created. It was God the Son. Let me show you. So a little theology break there. John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. This is referring to Jesus as the Logos of God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was anything made that was made. So when we read in Genesis 1:1 that in the beginning, Elohim, that plural, single plural God, created, we now recognize that God the Father willed the creation and God the Son created the creation. Yet there's one God. So don't hear three gods out running around doing stuff. Hear in a way that we cannot fathom. One God who exists in three persons, yet He's one God. And is that hard to get your head around? Absolutely hard. My head is still not around it. But that is the declaration of Scriptures. And here we learn it was the second person of the Godhead who created. But it's not just here. One of my favorite verses, Colossians. He, that's Jesus, has delivered us from the domain of darkness. He's transferred us to the kingdom of His beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of our sins. He is the image, the fire embossed, stamped out image of the invisible God. He's the firstborn, the preeminent one of all creation. For by Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created by Him and for Him. Little story. I was having a discussion with a friend. And he said, what do you think about extraterrestrials? You know? And again, we love these types of questions. And I said, well, I don't think there's any other life than what we see here on earth. He said this, well, I just have a problem that God created all this for us. I said, well, there's your confusion. He didn't create it for us. He created it for Himself to bring glory to Him. The entire creation is screaming, there's a glorious, magnificent God. Look at it. That's what Paul says. All things were created for Him, through Him, and He is before, He's the preeminent one, all things, and in Him all things hold together. We'll jump a few verses just so you see it now. This makes sense when we read towards the end of chapter 1. Then God said, let us make man in our image. They didn't understand it. I get it. We wouldn't have understood it at the time. I get it. We do now, though. This is the one God who exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there at creation, the Father is willing, the Son is creating. That's what we should see. And so you should be wondering, where's the Holy Spirit? Well, you know, he's like one verse away. We're getting ready to get to him. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Again, we talked about Shemayim for heavens, plural. I think I give you the verses here. No, I don't. Okay, so as we come here, what you should have at this point in your mind is God has this planet covered in water. He's created it in the darkness. Light has not been created. There's no form of light. That's what you should have in your mind where we are right now. To give you how Rich would understand this, and this is just so you can throw this away as soon as you're done hearing it. This is just Rich's explanation. In our beginning, God the Son created the heavens and the earth out of nothing. The earth was unformed, unfinished, unfilled, and darkness was over the face of the waters, which covered the entire planet. We're coming to talk about that. And the Spirit of God was fluttering, vibrating, hovering over the face of the waters, energizing God's creation that the Son had just brought into existence out of nothing.
Unfished.
Oh, did I? Well, it was unfished as well. That's a good point. Not only unfinished, unfished. Thank you, brother. So that is definitely don't go with that translation for sure. Okay. Now again, I told you that I believe that this was, though, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. I think the summary statement of all this is in 2:1. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished. But we'll get there soon enough. Okay, so back to our verses. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Tohu va bohu. It means unformed and unfilled. It means incomplete with no life. It means like framed in but not done. If you've ever been to a house where there's just frame and no sheetrock, you might refer to that, if you were using Hebrew terms, as tohu bohu. It's formed up but unfinished and unfilled. There's no one ready to live in this puppy just yet. And that was the earth right then. It was this water-covered planet, and that's all we have. It is unformed and unfinished. It is unfilled. We go on to read, so the earth is tohu bohu, and darkness was over the face of the deep. So here we picture, has light been created? No. Has any star been created? No. We have an earth covered in water, spinning in space, surrounded by darkness. Darkness is over the face of the deep. That's what we should have in our minds so far. Let's keep reading. God speaks. Let there be light. Again, 10 times we see this. And God saw the light, and there was light, and God saw the light that it was good. God separated the light from darkness. He called the light day, the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. So all of a sudden, there's darkness over the face of the deep. God speaks, let there be light, and there is light. Now, here's the mind bend. God will not create the stars and the sun until day 4. On day 1, he creates light. Light is now illuminating our planet, but he has not created a star. He has not created our sun. Now, there are people who would say, no, Rich, he actually created it here, but it's covered by dust or clouds or something, and it won't become visible until day 4. That's a stretch. I'll let you guys get there, read it when you get there. I believe he right now created light. Now, if that's hard for you to swallow, then maybe it is. This comes out of the Revelation, the new heaven and the new earth. Let's read it. Let me get my notes caught up. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. And the city had no need of a sun or a moon to shine on it. Why? Because the glory of God gives it light. Go ahead. Mike's coming.
Go back to the slide. Then, so, because you had mentioned earlier the second sentence, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters.
We're coming.
Okay.
We're coming. God was the light. Now, if you doubt that, look at how John deals with Christ. Now, I want you to see the connection back to Genesis. In the beginning was the Word. We quoted this earlier. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shined into darkness, and the darkness could not extinguish it. It could not put it out. It could not stop it. He is grabbing back to Genesis language to tell us that Jesus was the light that illuminated our planet in the very first place, and He remains that light that no one can extinguish. And I believe that's the point in Genesis chapter 1. The sun has not yet been created, but there's this spinning water-covered globe with the Son of God illuminating it with His glory. That's the picture I think we should take away from Genesis 1. But Kitty has a question.
I don't have a question.
Oh.
I just see the light shines in the darkness, and I see that as Jesus being the light, and the darkness, the evil in the world will never overcome Him.
Come on up here. You got it. Take over. You got it. Come on. Come on up here. Come on, Clint.
Why did He say, "Let there be light," if He was light?
So keep in mind, the Bible is written with anthropomorphic language. Anthropos being man. It's written for us, right? God didn't need to say a word, actually. Does God need to speak to make things happen? Like it's somehow creation's connected to His vocal cords, the God who doesn't have vocal cords, right? The God who has no body. He doesn't need to speak. So what I believe we have is anthropomorphic language to help us understand what's going on. Great question, and hopefully, yeah, you know.
Take that up with God.
And again, please don't accept that I'm totally right about everything. I'm really telling you how I understand this text and the beauty that's behind it and how it points us to the Lord Jesus Christ, who created everything out of nothing.
Do you think God looks like man?
When we look at Jesus, He's going to look just like man. Now, God the Father is spirit. The Bible tells us that clearly. The Father is spirit. The day came when the Son, who must have been spirit as well, took upon Himself the form of man, according to Philippians chapter 2, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, He humbled Himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross.
Well, where it says, He created man in His image. So, and a lot of people say it's a woman, it's a man, whatever. Personally, I think He created man and said, "Oh, I can do better than that," and then came woman.
And I will give you this testimony. He did a lot better. That's all I'll say. He did a lot better, absolutely. Now keep in mind, when God did this, did He know that Jesus was going to step out of eternity into time and take upon Himself the form of a man? Absolutely. Jesus is referred to in the book of the Revelation as the Lamb slain. Who can finish it? Before, thank you, Mike, the foundation of the world. In the mind of God, it was a done deal. Jesus was stepping out of eternity into time in the person of Christ, and He was going to die for our sins, and no one could stop it. No one could extinguish that plan. So hopefully that answered the question, but yes, He did much better when He created that one. Okay, let's get the next verse, though. So notice that the Spirit of God is hovering over the face of the waters. Pastor talked about this on a Wednesday. Fluttering, vibrating, brooding is the idea of the Hebrew. It's almost like an eagle or a chicken would brood over their nest. I don't know what's going on here, but I'll give you my thought. The Son of God had just created everything, and the Spirit of God is energizing what He just created. And we have all three persons of the Godhead there at creation. The Father willing, the Son creating, the Spirit energizing. You say, well, Rich, I have a problem with that. In Romans 8, Paul said this, the same Spirit that rose Jesus from the grave will quicken your mortal body too. You see, I would argue the Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, that body that did not see corruption but was definitely dead, although obviously the Spirit was never dead, is the same Spirit who energized our creation in the very first place. That's what I would argue. That's why we're even told something that seems like, what's up with the Spirit of God vibrating over the waters? I believe he's actually energizing this entire creation. Just my thoughts. And God saw the light that it was good. God separated the light from darkness. He called the light day, the darkness he called night. And then we begin the formula. And the evening and the morning was and this one actually says day one, Yom. So I want to say a couple of things there before we get away from this topic. This is where a lot of people disagree on what's being told right here. Evening and morning were the first day. There are those who believe that these are not literal 24-hour days, like Rich believes, but they are periods, maybe thousands of years, maybe millions of years, long periods of time under the banner of day one, and they would argue that the word day can be used that way. And of course it can. Our own word day can be used that way. So let's talk about this. The word day is used 2,301 times in the Hebrew Bible. That's a lot. It's a common word. Most of the time, though, it means a literal 24-hour day, but it can mean a few different things, just like our word day can mean. So how do you know? I'm so glad you asked. Let's give an example of how you know. I'll do it in English. Back in my father's day, it took 10 days to drive across the Australian outback driving during the day. Now, I just used day 3 different ways, but you know the one that I'm referring to as 10 days, 10 24-hour periods, 10 literal days. You know it because of the context. You read it and seek to understand the context. And I would say that the context is enough, but it's actually more than that. If you leave Genesis 1, because that's where all the fighting's going on, that's where the argument's going on about evening and morning day. Oh, it doesn't mean a day. 410 times the word day, yom, is used with a number. 410 times, that's a lot. Evening and morning without the word day is used 38 times. Okay, interesting. Evening or morning with the word day is used 23 times, and night with day is used 52 times. Here's what you'll find. In all 410 times where day, yom, is used with a number, it always meant a literal day. How many days did Joshua march around Jericho? Was it 7,000 years, 7 million years, or 7 days? I won't answer. Evening and morning, when it's used together without day, 38 times always means an ordinary day. Evening or morning, when it's used with day, outside of Genesis 1, always means a literal day. Night, when it's used with day, always means, in the 52 times outside of Genesis 1, it's always a literal 24-hour day. I would argue God is laboring very hard through Moses to tell us that the evening and morning were the first day, that he meant a literal day. Now, you may be arguing, hold on, Madam, we'll get to a stopping point, and I'm going to go to you about the question. But I would say it's more than that. Let's go back to the giving of the law. This is Exodus 20. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is with you in your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. Now, that seems pretty straightforward to me. I'll give you another one. In Exodus 31, the retelling of the event, when God gave the 10 Commandments, Moses writes this: 6 days shall you work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel that in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. He rested from creating. He didn't rest from upholding the creation. He's always upholding all things by the word of his power. We just read it. But he rested from the creative act. And look at the next verse. And he, Yahweh, gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, 2 tables of the testimony, tables of stone, written with the finger of God. This is not what Moses thinks he heard. This is not how Moses is interpreting what God said. This is what God wrote on a stone when he gave it to Moses. And so we'll go to Matt.
Is it possible the problem isn't that we have a misconception of the time, but we have a misconception of how quickly or how much God can work in a time frame because of how little we can do in one day? You were talking about how if you're sitting on the shoulder of God that doesn't exist, did the earth just pop in, or was it a big swirl like a time lapsed movie where you watch 1,000 years go over in 4 seconds? Is it God just works faster than we can comprehend, and it only takes him one day to do everything that it would take our concept of nature thousands or millions of years to do?
Yes, I want to answer that in two ways. Number one, obviously, yes. But it's even bigger than that. God didn't need 6 days to create, y'all. God didn't need 6 seconds to create. God didn't need 6 milliseconds to create. God could have created faster than Rich can blink. And he could have created everything fully grown, fully functioning, ready to go, just like that. So then why 6 days and rest on the seventh day? He's setting, as best we can tell, the rhythm of worship for the nation of Israel. They're going to work 6 days and rest on the seventh day, constantly pointing back to the work that Yahweh did when he created all these things. And so could he do it faster? Yes. Did he need 6 days? No. We would never get this planet created. We need much more than 6 days. But absolutely, Matt. And it's even bigger than that. Now, it is funny to me, outside of the creation story, I know of no one who argues about the days outside of Genesis 1. Pick whatever example you want. Joshua marching around Jericho. How many days old is a boy when they circumcise him? How long was Jonah in the belly of a big fish? How many days did it rain during the global flood? In all of those cases, we're told days, and I've never ran into anyone who said, no, you are crazy. I know for a fact Joshua marched around Jericho 7,000 years. I'd laugh at him. It's for some reason only here that we argue about this. And I would argue, if I can continue arguing, that God did everything he could to make it crystal clear to us. And it's now just for us to lay hold of it by faith. Now, having said that, there are many good, godly people who would disagree with me. I've said things very strongly, and they would still disagree. And so if you disagree with me, you're not outside the camp of faith. You're not like reprobate. You're not like the only person on the planet who doesn't believe that. So although I've spoke very boldly and strongly and confidently and with great assurance, understand there are people much smarter, much more educated than me who believe different. Okay? So don't hear like, Rich just called me anathema. Yes, sir.
Well, the church had no problem with this at all until around the 1800s.
I agree, and we would argue that it's probably Charles Lyell and Charles Darwin that created some of the confusion.
It's been taught in our universities over and over and over as if it's fact, that it's millions, billions of years, that we as Christians are like, well, let me see if I can redo this in my mind to make this fit with what God said. It's the problem.
And that is definitely in some cases, but I don't want to say in all cases, because again, there are very intelligent, godly men and women who would disagree with me, and I don't want to discount them out of hand and act like these are people who don't know God and don't walk with him. So although I've been very bold, understand there are people who would be just as bold who would disagree.
Can you, all of this topic made me think, because there's so many names of God. What is the name of God that the Jewish people could not say?
So Yahweh was his name, and that was the one they were most careful with. You may hear it pronounced Jehovah. So depending on, we've lost how you pronounce it, but it's either Yahweh or Jehovah.
Yeah, but which name was it that they basically would not speak out loud, say his name?
I don't know for sure, Dean. I would assure it's Yahweh. Yeah, it's Yahweh.
It's Yahweh?
That was the covenant name of God. And again, some people pronounce it Jehovah, Yahweh. We're talking about the same name. Bill has a question in the back if you want to get him.
On a Sunday, and that's technically 48 hours if you think about it.
Sure, yeah. I mean, if you're arguing that 3 days were shrunk down to two and a portion of the third, true. And let's be honest, as God created in 6 days and rested on the seventh day, he wasn't, we don't think, creating all of the hours of that day. I guess he could have been, but we don't even consider it that way. We consider just counting. He created day 1, he created day 2, he created day 3. So we're not looking, at least I've never been looking, for 18 hours of creation that I can explain on day 1, but rather creative activity on day 1, creative activity on day 2, creative activity on day 3. And so when we see Christ was in the belly of that fish, the earth, 3 days, we recognize it's a partial day being accredited to a full day, and hopefully that answers your question, Bill. Maybe not to satisfactory, but hopefully. Yeah, Linda.
The beauty is the faith of a child.
Absolutely. So let me ask you a question before we move on, because, again, I don't want to fight over something we don't need to fight over. Where do we get the idea of day? One rotation. Put yourself anywhere on the planet. When you're there again, that's a day. What about month? Well, it's the moon orbiting around the earth. Now, obviously, it's not rotating. The same side is always facing us, but that's a month. Where do we get year? Well, that's our rotation around the sun. Where do we get the idea for a week? Genesis 1. I would argue we get the idea for a week from Genesis 1. It happens to be 1/4 of a lunar cycle, but I don't know of a single culture that doesn't recognize a week, which is odd to me. Okay, so in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the face of the deep. As best we understand, on day 1, God created the earth. He likely created the space around the earth. He created time. He created light. He could have created all the space. That might be possible. We'll talk about that as we get to day 4. But what we should see right now on day 1 is a water-covered, rotating planet, light bombarding it. That's the end of day 1. So it would seem. So before we advance, anything else that needs to be said, questioned, talked about before we move on? And see, we got out of day 1. Told you. Okay, let's go. That's why I started clapping. Verse 6. And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Now listen to this. You guys listen to this. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Now, what water do you know about right now? The only water you're aware of is the water covering the entire planet. That's the only water you're aware of. Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate waters from waters. So this expanse is going to have water, and it's going to separate water according to Moses. And God made the expanse, and he separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. So whatever this is we're being talked about, there's an expanse, and there's water below the expanse, and there's water, whoever wants to say it, not me, above the expanse, and that's God. Verse 8, and God called the expanse Shemayim, heavens or heaven. Context demands which one you go with. The translators chose heaven, singular. He called it heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day. And now you should all kind of go like this. What in the world is God saying through Moses? Let's talk about what we know. Here's what we know. What we see every day, and that's our current atmosphere. 5 layers. The troposphere, that's where the airplanes and the balloons and the birds, that's where we fly. The stratosphere, that's the upper, in fact, we desperately need the stratosphere. The mesosphere, when comets come in and burn, they're burning in the mesosphere. That's where you see them. The thermosphere, super duper cold, all the way to extremely cold, and then the exosphere, the final outer layer, and then outer space. The thermosphere, y'all, gets up to 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That is super duper hot. The thermosphere. The molecules are so far apart in the thermosphere, you wouldn't feel heat if you were there. Right? What? Go Google it. Don't believe me. The molecules are so far apart, if you and I were there. You ready for this? The International Space Station is in the, someone help me, thermosphere. And then we go to the exosphere where it's deathly cold. It goes right into space, which is extremely cold. My question is, God doesn't seem to be describing any of this. I look at the atmosphere, I talk to science, they say these are the layers. He seems to be talking about a layer of water vapor, ice. Let's be honest, if we put this thing in the mesosphere, negative 86 degrees Celsius, it would freeze instantly. That's Celsius. That's not Fahrenheit. That's like Celsius. Did it look like that? I don't know. But I do want to show you something. Actually, two somethings. This is from Josephus, and Josephus is not the Bible. He was a Jewish priest. He was a Roman historian. Here's what he said. He would probably represent thought at the time. After this, on the second day, that's God, placed the heaven over the whole world and separated it from the other parts and determined that it should stand by itself. He also placed a crystalline firmament around it. Just wanted you to see it.
When did he write that?
So this is like 70 AD-ish. Okay? This comes from astronomy.com. But you can Google this. Every time we were shooting up things into space, in particular the shuttle, most of the shuttle's engine is water vapor. Guess what happens to that water vapor? It freezes in the mesosphere and floats up there, and floats toward the poles, and floats as frozen water vapor in our mesosphere. Not Rich, this is astronomy.com. You can Google it. About 350 tons of water from every time we shoot a shuttle, and that water ends up frozen in the mesosphere floating at the poles. In fact, the article, if you just Google this, you'll find many articles. The articles will go on to say, and we really don't know if we keep doing this, what the long-term effect is continuing to put 350 million gallons of water up in our mesosphere. But nonetheless, you can Google this and find it. Did we have a water vapor or ice canopy? I do not know. I do want you to see the language that God used. Now, could he be referring to our atmosphere with water somehow above it? Sure, I'm not going to argue about it. I just want you to see it. So this will come up, and it's funny, Mike. So this will come up when we talk about the flood. The reason I even preloaded your canon now is so that as we get to the flood, you'll go, oh, that's weird. So absolutely, thank you. Okay, so let's get back to it. And you can see, called the expanse heaven, there's evening, there's morning, and we're at the second day. Anything else before we keep going and get to day 3? By the way, in your notes, I give you some things that came out of Henry Morris's Genesis record, changes that would have been occurring if indeed there was a water vapor or an ice canopy around the planet. And so you have those in your notes if you want to take a look at that. Am I saying there was? No, I'm not. I'm just saying, take a look at it. Doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, but God said it. Okay. No, that's going to come after the flood. So my brother said the first ice age. The ice age will come after the flood. We'll talk about that when we get to the global flood.
If that was so, it would protect the planet from UV rays, different things like that. So that may be one reason, man lived longer in the beginning.
And so to go to Sandy's point, if indeed there was a water vapor or ice canopy, thin ice canopy around the planet, it probably would have been destroyed in the global catastrophe that was the flood. We'll not be told that it rains on the planet until the flood. But we'll save all that for another time and another discussion. Okay, let's get to verse 9. And God said, now watch this. If you thought the last one was a mine, Ben, check this one out. And God said, let the waters under heaven. Now, where are the waters under heaven? They're on the face of the planet, right? We have some water above the heaven, it seems like, but we'll just live with that for now. Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place. They are gathered together in one place. They're covering the entire face of this planet. An inch deep, a foot deep, 100 feet deep, 1,000 feet deep. We don't know, but they're covering the face of the planet. Let the waters be gathered together and let dry land appear. Imagine what that looked like if you'd have been standing there that day. And you would have watched as waters were gathered together, whatever that means, and the dry land comes out of the water and the gathering together of the waters. Was God talking about forming deep ocean basins, or was he talking about something else? Yes, Kristen.
So how would the Earth's core come into play with like this? If he's forming the land on the surface, would the core have been created at the same time?
The core's already here.
Okay.
And so all of the water's on the face of the planet. And now he's going to gather the water together. And in that event, whatever he means, that event causes dry land to appear. Now I want to show you some things from the Bible. How much time do we have? Who's got the clock? 5 minutes? Okay. I'll just show you a couple of verses. Again, I'm not trying to make any point. I just want you to read them. Psalm of David, this is Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell in it. For he founded it upon the seas, and he established it on the rivers. Did God gather the water together in subterranean chambers when he did this creative act on day 3? And that event caused dry. Is that what David's talking about? Because we didn't know anything like this. Let me give you another one. There's a lot of them, by the way. I'll just give you a few. To him who alone does great wonders, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who by understanding made the heavens, for his steadfast love endures forever. To him who spread out the earth above the waters, for his steadfast love endures forever. Notice these words, founding the earth on the water. Let's look at Job. Here, this is where God interacts with Job. Job's been kind of whining, and God shows up, and he's going to really call Job out. Where were you? And here's what he says. Dress for action like a man. I will question you and make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? When I founded the earth? Again, if we go back to those Psalms, founded on water. Zechariah, the oracle of the word of the Yahweh concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens. By the way, 17 times the Bible tells us God stretched out the heavens like a curtain. I don't know what you thought creation looked like, but here's the picture of God creating the heavens. And as best we can tell, based on redshifting in light from the Hubble Space Telescope, it is still stretching out today. It's still expanding today. 17 times the Old Testament told us that when no one thought that was the case. Everyone thought the creation was fixed and static. 17 times stretched out the heavens like you would do a curtain. But thus declares the Lord, who stretched out the heavens and founded the earth again and formed the spirit of man within them. And so what are we being told here? It seems, again, I'm not dogmatic, I'm not trying to make a point, but it seems when God gathered the water, he gathered at least some of it in subterranean chambers. This will become critical when you wonder, where did all the water come from in the global flood? From the subterranean chambers that he gathered it in, principally in day 3. Now, there's probably still surface oceans and things like that, but just understand what's going on. And we see, he looks at it, he sees that it is good, and we'll end here. Oh, there's a question in the back. We won't end here. We may end here before we get here.
I just wanted to point out that in Revelation 6:14, it says that the sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up. So it's stretched out and then it's
Stretched
rolled
out,
up.
rolled up. Now, I want to jump a few verses just to wrap you up with something I wanted to show you. We'll come back here at verse 11 and pick back up here next week, Lord willing. I want to jump you to the 4th day when he creates the sun, the moon, and all the stars. I want you to see, notice how Moses does this. Verse 16, God made the 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And he made stars. Anybody know how many stars the current estimate is? 100? $200 sextillion. Not a number we typically use, larger than the national debt. We're talking a big number. A 200 with 21 zeros. Now, if you're like me, that's a hard number to process, right? Let me help you process it. The current estimate of grains of sand on the earth is less than that. That may help you process it. Go stand down to the beach. How do we know? I'm glad you asked this question. Man, we have the Hubble Space Telescope. We look everywhere. Here we are, 6,500 light years from Earth. This is M16. This is the Eagle Nebulae. Look at what our Father did. These things back here are not stars. Those are galaxies.
Full of stars.
This is active galaxy full of millions of stars. This is M82. By the way, it's about 12 million light years from Earth. These things in the back behind M82, they're not stars. They're galaxies. This is the Sombrero Galaxy, M104, 28 million light years from Earth. Look at that thing our Father made. Those things back there in the background, galaxies. This is the Spiral Whirlpool Galaxy, NGC 1672, even further away, 60 million light years. Those bright things behind this galaxy, more galaxies. This is the Barred Spiral Galaxy, NGC 1300. These bright things, galaxies, 70 million light years. Now, I do want to come in now to the Whirlpool Galaxy M51. This is 23 million light years away. And so these are all coming from the Hubble Space Telescope. You can go home and Google this. You can go find all these pictures. I didn't make these up. So what the scientists did, and we're going to end here just to see it. They said, we know what should be at the center of this Whirlpool Galaxy, and it should be a black hole that's holding this galaxy together. And so what do you think they did? They took Hubble and honed it in right into the center of this Whirlpool Galaxy and took a picture. Here's the picture. Okay. So, Rich, are you saying that there's a picture of the cross at the center of the Whirlpool Galaxy? No. No. We realize that this is dust and light and gas and optics and all of that. But you know what I will tell you? We'll end with this. The heavens declare the glory of God. The firmament shows forth his handiwork. Day unto day it utters speech, and night unto night it shows knowledge. And even when unbelieving science, and with one of their greatest creations, the Hubble Space Telescope, our amazing God is always trying to communicate. I know it's just light and dust and optics. I get it. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the chance to be here today. Lord, we'll pick back up day 3, verse 11. But I did want to